Welcome to the Behaviorist Book Club. We are a community of busy, research-focused practitioners, ABA, behavior analysts, just trying to stay in touch with the literature. This is Matt, and I am the host of this lovely podcast. You can follow me at my website, www.behavioristbookclub.com, and you can find me on Twitter and Facebook. This series is Java in one take, and today's episode is on volume number 54, number 4. This was done at the Kennedy Krieger and Johns Hopkins Institute and School of Medicine, and it's entitled The Assessment and Treatment of Tracheotomy Tube Manipulation, tracheotomy tube manipulation, and the effects of competing stimuli and protective equipment. This is a replication and extension of the reduction in dangerous medical tube manipulations. Off the bat, this was where I got trained. This is where I did my master's degree. I did it at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and I worked at the Kennedy Krieger Institute in the inpatient unit, and this study was done with a client on the outpatient unit. I absolutely love the methodology used in the study. I don't know if I would say that self-injurious behavior or automatically maintained behavior is my specialty. I'd like to say it is because I probably have the most experience in it. I don't know if I'm arrogant enough to call it a specialty, but I will say that it's one of my favorite topics to read about. So when I saw this study, I got really excited. I just ate it up, and I think that you'll really enjoy it too. So functional analyses have been applied sparingly to tracheotomy tube manipulation behavior. The only exceptions being a study done in 1997 and then another one in 2004. Typically, tracheotomy tube manipulation results in an automatic function, but there definitely could be an attention from medical professionals or an escape from an aversive situation. So the authors note that it's really important to engage in a functional analysis prior to treating this behavior. So tracheotomy tube manipulation is a very severe self-injury style of behavior. This is when the child fiddles or even sometimes disconnects the tracheotomy tube that's assisting their breathing. And if that ventilator tube disconnects, the individual can start to choke and lose oxygen and not be able to breathe and need immediate hospitalization and emergency medicine. So if you can imagine, just from a safety perspective, this is an insanely dangerous behavior, but also from a financial and cost burden to the caregivers of the individual who's engaging in this behavior, it can be a lot with the constant medical bills only because there was a behavior that could have been prevented. So this is a really severe behavior, but it just hasn't been studied much in research. I think that possibly maybe because there's just not a lot of instances of it in the general ABA world, but when it does occur, it is a really significant behavior that needs to be reduced as soon as possible. So the treatments, when it is an automatic function, typically consists of non-contingent access to a competing item plus some kind of response blocking or sensory extinction. So this non-contingent reinforcement and competing stimuli may be successful treatment paths, but there's little literature to back up the application of these treatments to this specific topography. Like I said, there's really a dearth of research with this topography of behavior, but logic would tell us that if non-contingent reinforcement and competing stimulus assessments do work for other automatically maintained behaviors, they will also work for this automatically maintained behavior with a couple changes and caveats. For example, if you're going to utilize response blocking for tracheotomy tube manipulation is going to look very different than response blocking for head hitting. It's going to be, a block of a fist versus perhaps a collar being put around the tracheotomy tube. So a couple caveats, but generally speaking, if the function is the same, then the treatments can begin to look the same with a couple manipulations. The combination of the competing stimulus assessment as a systematic way to select items to use for non-contingent reinforcement is definitely an empirically validated solution and has been termed the augmented competing stimulus assessment. The augmented competing stimulus assessment, or the A-CSA as I'm going to refer to it, has just the addition of prompting plus response blocking, which assists when no items are identified during the initial competing stimulus assessment as effective competing items. So the goal of a competing stimulus assessment is to find an item that, when present, reduces the probability that the dangerous behavior will occur. However, in that first competing stimulus assessment, if you try out 10 different items and nothing works, that's when you may move into the augmented competing stimulus assessment, the A-CSA, where you add in prompting, you add in response blocking, and you start to see more engagement rise. So the purpose of this paper was to replicate and extend previous methods using this new and updated methodology. They wanted to extend those papers that just applied the competing stimulus assessment or the non-contingent reinforcement because they didn't know about the augmented competing stimulus assessment because that A-CSA has just come out in the last few years. So for their methods, it's not a very complex paper. They had one participant, age 5. The child had tracheotomy surgery shortly after birth. They required 24 hours of nursing care, and the manipulation and or the removal of the tube had occurred multiple times just within the last month and would result in emergency medical each time it got severe. They worked in an outpatient setting, which I mentioned before, 5 days a week for 3 weeks. This was the intensive outpatient done at the Kennedy Krieger Institute. And it was, I don't know the exact times, but it's essentially like 9 to 4. Like it is intensive outpatient. And the model is really, really fascinating. They take a kid or an adult or somebody who exhibits a lot of dangerous behaviors, and they put them through a functional analysis. They work on immediate problem behavior reduction. They get the individual to the point where their severe behavior is reduced enough so that another practitioner can take over and see more success with them. But perhaps that practitioner who they're sending them to didn't have the capabilities of reducing the severe behavior in the moment. And that's why they needed to go to the outpatient. Emergency medicine did observe all of the sessions and would terminate if medical attention was needed. So this is another really powerful thing about the Kennedy Krieger Institute, is that it is a stone's throw away from Johns Hopkins. So there are multiple times when I worked there that a situation would occur in which somebody got injured, whether it be staff or a client, and we were able to have emergency medicine there as soon as possible. There was also a nurse observing all of these sessions, and this is where I think it comes down to know your limits. What I'm going to describe in this paper isn't exactly groundbreaking. I think it's really solid behavior analysis. I don't think it was easy what these authors did by any means, but it's not so difficult that nobody else could replicate it if they had an individual who engaged in tracheotomy tube manipulation. However, just because you've read this paper doesn't mean that you are now equipped to go work with that severe topography. If you don't have nursing on staff at all times to observe the individual engaging in this behavior, I don't know. I don't know if I would assess a behavior this severe if I knew that one mess up could potentially cost this kid their life. Actually, I know that I wouldn't work on that behavior. I think this brings us back to the same conversation we've had about feeding and how behavioral feeding can be really technical and really precise. And just because you know how to do some of the strategies doesn't mean you should go out and do behavioral feeding. You need to have the appropriate precautions in place before you do. And I think that thought generalizes to this setting as well. Know your limits as a clinician. It may be that you can apply the A-CSA and reduce this behavior with the best of them, but if you don't feel like you're able to keep the client safe, it's a non-starter. You need to give that kid and recommend and refer that kid to a location where they can be safe. The dependent variables, sorry for that rant, the dependent variables they used was, of course, the tube manipulation and visual engagement with leisure items. So they were measuring eye gazing towards leisure items. This kid had limited movement, and really what they were looking at is how much did the face tilt towards the leisure items, because he wasn't able to grab them and engage with them as somebody else might be able to. They first did a functional analysis. It was a standard functional analysis. There was no tangible condition because there was no evidence that this behavior was reinforced by the tangible. They did add a different attention style of condition, which simulated the home setting and the natural environment. In addition, another manipulation they did is they did a seated functional analysis and a prone functional analysis. They did this to determine if there was a different function during the seated versus prone. They found that there was not, and it was all every occurrence of the behavior seemed to be maintained by automatic sources of reinforcement. So that pushed us right into the A-CSA, to which there was first a free access condition, which is where there was a test and a no stimulus control trial. Items were placed in front of the individual and there was no other manipulation. The sessions lasted about 2 or 3 minutes, depending on if it was prone or seated, and they were chosen by the rates of behavior in the ignore or alone condition in the functional analysis. Now, the way the free access condition looked was very simply the individual was in the room. They were running the ignore condition of the functional analysis, so there was no engagement by the therapist. And the therapist placed the leisure item directly in front of the child and then simply tracked behavior. There was no other prompting, nothing else like that. That was for a test condition. They also compared those stimulus items to a no stimulus control trial, in which it was identical to the no stimulus, the ignore condition of the functional analysis. They then did a prompting and protective equipment condition, in which it was identical to the free access with the addition of 10-second prompts to engage with the item, as well as the addition of a protective collar around the tracheotomy tube. Every instance of touching the tracheotomy collar was also counted as self-injury or manipulation in this case. So just because the behavior wasn't possible, that the child couldn't reach the tracheotomy tube, they were still counting attempts as the dependent variable. They then, after they found effective competing items, moved to the treatment evaluation. They used a reversal design. They first went to baseline, which was similar to the ignore condition of the FA. They then did the prompting and protective equipment condition. So they looked at all the items that were found to be competing during the A-CSA, and they put them into the prompting and protective equipment condition. It was identical to those same treatment conditions, but the individual had access to 2 of those different competing items. After they found that there was a reduction of behavior in the prompting and protective equipment condition, they did a component analysis because they hypothesized that the collar may be more responsible for the reduction in problem behavior instead of the prompting. So they took away the prompting and just had the collar, and then they began to fade the prompting schedule, and then they did a generality condition with the nurse. As I said, the functional analysis did indicate automatic, and the A-CSA during the free access condition showed minimal engagement with different competing items. There was minimal engagement, and there was high instances of tube touching. So then they did the prompting and protective equipment addition and the next condition, and they found that it was actually reversed. So they found really high engagements and really low rates of tube touching, indicating that there was multiple different competing items that were available to the child when prompting and the collar was placed on him. Now, the result of the treatment analysis then showed that first, both prompting and protective equipment was useful in reducing behavior. They immediately found a reduction in tube touching relative to baseline when they put in prompting and protective equipment. They then, when they did their component analysis, found that while the collar alone did reduce tube touching, it didn't reduce it to a clinically significant level. It was found that prompting definitely was needed so that high amounts of engagement and low amounts of tube touching maintained. The generalization probes and the schedule thinning probes did go well regarding the tube manipulation. Engagement did drop during these conditions, especially during the prompting fade. It seems pretty clear that the prompting was actually more of a vital component than I think people originally hypothesized. And I think this probably was because the prompting seemed to control the engagement with the leisure items, which makes sense because why would a collar control their engagement with the leisure items? But the engagement with the leisure items really seemed to be a competing source of reinforcement versus that, or rather a competing source of reinforcement that really reduced tube touching. So what that indicates is that we have two behavioral contingencies at play here. It seems like we have sensory extinction in forms of the collar, and we have competing sources of reinforcement. It seems like that perhaps the collar may have been less needed than the prompting. With high amounts of prompting, which results in high amounts of engagement, perhaps the competing sources of reinforcement that was selected from the competing stimulus assessment would have reduced problematic behavior without the use of the collar at all. They didn't end up doing that assessment. I'm guessing it's because parents or other stakeholders indicated that the collar made them feel more comfortable. That's really pretty common when you work with kids with severe self-injury. Sometimes you find that the protective equipment that is put on may not be as needed for you as a clinician, but the parents or the caregivers feel much more comfortable knowing that everybody is safe and they don't have to worry about it as much. But I think that I wish they would have reversed their component analysis and evaluated just prompting without the collar and see what would have happened. That would have been really, really interesting. So overall, this study was a straightforward and clear A-CSA demonstration. It demonstrated the use of the A-CSA to a novel topography of behavior. It showed the utility and flexibility of not only the A-CSA, but also the functional analysis in evaluating different topographies of behavior. And there was a big big emphasis on safety and generalization, which was, I think, fantastic as well. The fact that they had the nurses there who were able to watch and observe all sessions. And then also the fact that they did generalization sessions with the home nurse who would be taking care of the child was also really valuable. Key takeaways, the A-CSA continues to be, in my humble opinion, the most powerful plus humane way to reduce automatically maintained behavior. I've seen it work many times. I've used it myself. It's really one of my most preferred ways of reducing automatically maintained behavior because I think it's just very kind. You're not putting anything on extinction. You're not punishing anything. You're simply giving and teaching different options to this child and bumping up the leisure skills that are available. The second takeaway is that the application of the A-CSA to resistant to treatment behavior is also interesting. Resistance to treatment behavior may look like the child who engages in destructive behavior and your functional analysis says it's for attention, but because the behavior is so destructive, it's hard to use attention extinction or non-contingent reinforcement as a treatment component. There's just simply a barrier there and you can't get the behavior to reduce. Based on the matching law and the logic of a competing stimulus assessment, it may be possible to conduct a non-function matched competing stimulus assessment, so a non-function matched A-CSA. I think that in that same scenario with the kid who has high amounts of aggressive behavior that is resistant to treatment, perhaps the fact that you're now placing competing items and teaching alternative leisure skills through the A-CSA may be a really powerful behavior reduction tool. I'd love to see the application of the A-CSA across different functions and not only topographies of automatically maintained behavior. And for our consideration, I've praised the A-CSA enough, but I want to say one more time that it's a really powerful tool, but it's a new research topic. It just came out in the last couple years. The only reason I'm lucky enough to know about it is because I was around when they were developing it. And I'm really lucky in that way. But a lot of BCBAs have never learned it. So I just want you to think about, and this keeps me up at night myself, what have you missed by not staying up to date with the literature? That's the whole point of this podcast. It was my response to my own limitations. I wasn't staying in touch with the literature. I wasn't being as good of a BCBA as I could have. So I said, all right, well, I'll just read everything. And I don't want to miss anything. I don't want to miss a valuable treatment that could change one of my clients' lives. So I just want to float the question to you. Have you been staying on top of the literature? And if not, are you worried that you've missed something? Because I definitely have. And I think trying to consume it all now is I'm trying to make up for it. But who knows when I've read something that I just think, man, if I had known that just 1 year ago, that would have made all the difference. I guess that's kind of a somber note to end on, but it is Wednesday, which means we got one more on Friday, guys. This last one on Friday, I might shed a tear because this is the first time this podcast has covered an entire issue. Friday will be the final article and podcast from volume number 54, issue number 4. I hope to see/listen to you guys all there. Remember to check out my website, www.behavioristbookclub.com, Facebook, Twitter. You guys know where it is. Thank you and have a wonderful day.